Hey, welcome back to the channel, everybody. I'm Ham Radio Dude. Thanks for checking out the channel. In this episode, I'd like to compare to you the UV-9R from Baofeng and the UV-9R Plus and determine, is there really a significant difference at all? Should you be buying the UV-9R over the UV-9R Plus? And if so, what should you do with that extra money? So let's go ahead and jump into things. Before we get started, I need to mention my sponsor, the subscribe button. Go ahead and click it. Every click makes me happy.
Your source for amateur radio news, reviews, and tech overviews. This is Ham Radio Dude.
Back in July of 2020, I decided I would purchase an IP67 rated radio, throw it in the water and see how it did, and that radio was the Baofeng UV-9R Plus. But on top of just throwing it in the water to test its IP67 claims, I have over the months tested the battery and tested multiple things to find out that this radio might not be any different than the UV-9R. And my suspicions were confirmed by somebody on Amazon just a few days ago. Let's take a look at that review. As you can see, it's actually just somebody giving their input on a question. It's not really a review, but is there a difference between the UV-9R and the UV-9R Plus? Well, this individual says no, and I would have to somewhat agree. So I went ahead and I bought a UV-9R, actually bought two of them, and we're going to test out the UV-9R versus the UV-9R Plus and find out what the differences actually are, if they're significant. This radio was purchased back in July, and one of the things I've noticed immediately is they've since taken away the power rating of this radio. Whereas they used to claim this was an 8-watt radio, and some other people would claim it's a 15-watt radio. The supplier I purchased this from no longer claims 8 watts. In fact, if you look through this page, there is no indication of how much power output there actually is on this radio. Additionally, this radio is advertised as 2200 milliamp hour battery life and IP67 rated. Those are the key features that would make somebody want to upgrade from a radio like the UV-9R, which offers a maximum output power of 5 watts, an 1800 milliamp hour battery, IP67 ratings, and additionally, I noticed that the UV-9R Plus had mentioned that they do crossband receive and transmit, whereas the UV-9R only does crossband receive. What is crossband repeat? What is crossband receive? Well, to start off, crossband receive is what they call dual VFO, or essentially having two frequencies on the radio at once being able to be monitored. Now, when we look at crossband repeat, we take those two frequencies and we receive on one of them. All the meanwhile, we're repeating or retransmitting onto the other frequency, or the bottom one. That's all. So here are the two radios side by side. Upon initial investigation, I think anybody could be fooled on which one is which. Yeah, one says UV-9R on the front, but the other one says UV-9R Plus. If we look on the back of the radio, you will see that the UV-9R Plus does show 8 watts on there, as opposed to the Baofeng UV-9R, which doesn't specify anything but 5 watts. That's something to keep in mind here as we continue on with these tests. In fact, let's go ahead and just check right now the output power of these radios. And you're going to see right now I have the two radios side by side, but I have only one battery, and that's the battery from the UV-9R Plus. I fully charged the battery, but I wanted to only use just one, so the results could be as consistent as possible, meaning I'm eliminating other variables that might come into play. Maybe you got a bad battery, maybe whatever. And so that's exactly what I did. Now I do check with the multimeter, and this battery fully charged reads 8.32 volts, which is pretty typical of what I've seen with the BL9 series battery. Now, I do want to just mention real quick that, of course, in order to get accurate tests, you need really expensive service monitors and really great cables and everything, and I completely understand that. I want to work to get that equipment, and hopefully soon I will have that equipment, because I find it fascinating. But until then, I'm using a power meter from Diamond Antennas, and I found this Diamond Antenna power meter to be fairly accurate throughout my prior tests. And here I test the Baofeng UV-9R Plus, and on high power it shows just over 5 watts of power. That was pretty consistent on both UHF and VHF. And I did test this on UHF a couple of times, and sometimes I saw this go up to 5.5 watts or so roughly. I now put the battery in the UV-9R and I ran the same test, and to my surprise, the UV-9R only put out about 4 watts of power on both UHF and VHF. Do at least have the assumption that the UV-9R Plus does produce a little bit more power than the UV-9R. And in post-editing, I just thought of something, and I wanted to make a note and add a couple things on here. Here I am testing the other UV-9R I purchased on high power, and it tests out to 5 watts. If I bring it down to mid power, it'll test at 3 watts, and then low power, around 1.5 watts to 2 watts. I just thought it was important to mention that and test this, since I did buy 2 of these radios. I thought to myself, the cool thing to do would be to tear both of these radios apart. This is going to be fun for multiple reasons, and one of them being I've never torn apart an HT before, but also I've never torn apart an IP67 rated anything before. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a time lapse now. I'll come back and I will explain a couple of small issues I ran into, and then we'll compare the boards to see if there's any significant differences between the boards, if I can get them fully apart. Now you were going to see that I got the radio apart, but there was a couple of mistakes, and I learned from them, and I hope you learn from them before you make the mistake. But number one, when you're taking the casing apart, be very careful and do it slowly, because the speaker has 2 ribbon cables there, and the ribbon cables will easily get ripped off the speaker. Also, you'll see that my LCD is completely intact right here, but at some point during this whole teardown process, I must have set it against like a screw or something on this table, and it caused damage to the LCD. So remember, when you have this thing apart, the LCD is no longer protected by your casing, your external casing, which usually does a pretty good job. And it's so sensitive, in fact, if you think about it, that I've thrown this radio out the window multiple times. Never a problem, but the second I had it out of that casing, ooh, just wanted you to keep that in mind. Other things I noticed and I observed about this was, there was a 2009 labeling on there. I'm not sure if that means when this radio was manufactured. It was 2019, excuse me. So when I did actually get this radio apart and I noticed the date on there, right below the date, I noticed something there that said WP970, and I think it was an L. If I reference that number, it shows up to a Baofeng A58 board, which makes sense because if you look at the FCC certification under Part 15, the A58 is the same as the UV-9R, but it doesn't mention the UV-9R Plus. This information proved to be very valuable for me, and the reason it was so valuable is you could now see the FCC ID, the Part 15 rating, the models associated with it. But if you page down, you'll see this right here. And what it shows is 1800 milliamp hour, 7.4 volt, charging with 8.4 volts. Looking a little further down the charging parameter, the output is 8.4 volts at 0.4 amps or 400 milliamp hours. And why is this so important? I'll now be able to conduct tests with this device right here. Instead of just doing it at 1 amp drain, I now know that if I do it at 0.4 amps or 400 milliamp hours, I will get the actual rating of the batteries. Pretty cool. And actually, I shouldn't say that I know that for a fact, but that's what I do believe, and I'll test it out here in just a moment or two. I then tore apart the UV-9R and added a little bit of confusion to this whole process, but also maybe answered a couple of questions along the way. Now, once I got the board disassembled, I noticed the board said 970 TS. So I looked that number up on Google, and this is where I got a little bit surprised. On Google, I actually noticed that this thing just went in for FCC certification for Part 95 or GMRS about 2 days before making this video. So it's pretty interesting they're not the same board. I thought they would be the same board, but that's where the power confusion came in handy. If I page down in this document, I will see that it says the maximum output power of this radio is 3.5 watts. So there is some differences. It was at this point I decided, hey, let's get these things back together and look at the version number. You could always check that out by holding down 3 and turning on the radio. I did find that the version number on both of these radios was the same, NT5101. I did look up some of that firmware online, the NT5101, and I was looking for features of that specific version firmware, hoping I could find something that would reference this is a crossband repeat transmit capable radio, which, come on, we know it's not. But I didn't find anything. And even though I didn't find anything, I think it's nice to know that they are the same firmware version. This is when I decided to scroll through the menu system, and they're the same identical menu system. In post-editing, I decided maybe I should just show you guys the results of the spectrum analyzer test, even though I typically don't like to show you these, and again, they shouldn't be considered any kind of official results. However, this is the result of the UV-9R Plus at 146.52 on my spectrum analyzer. And this is the result on the UV-9R on 146.52. Pretty significant difference. That leaves only two things for us to test. First, let's test the battery, and because I tested the UV-9R battery at an earlier date at 1 amp hour of draw, that's what I did with the UV-9R battery. You're going to see here that I have a continual load tester, this one right here, and it says 1.65 amp hours on it. The reason it says 1.65 amp hours is because the last battery I tested was 1.65 amp hours at 1 amp hour of drain. That battery happened to be the Baofeng UV-9R Plus battery. So here I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing, 1 amp of drain, even though I now know in the future 0.4 would probably be better. And the first thing I do is I check to make sure that I have a full charge on the battery. And you're going to see here I'm at 8.32 volts, which again is typical of what I see on these batteries. So I start the test. I decided to stop the video or the time lapse right here so I could just explain to you. You saw this go from 4.87 volts, I believe it was, all the way to 0 instantaneously, and that's typical. See, these batteries do have built-in components or chips to say, hey, don't let this battery fully drain to 0, because if you do, you might have some hard times getting this battery to function correctly in the future. And so it did what it was supposed to do. But I think what we see here is something around 1.62 amp hours, which you'll see on the screen. And what that tells me is these batteries are nearly identical, which I thought they were. So we know a couple of things so far, but let's finish our test with the water torture test of the UV-9R. Will it survive 30 minutes? Both of these radios survived the underwater test, this one being about 30 minutes, and if you recall on the UV-9R Plus, I pulled that one out at about 15 minutes. But they both had approximately the same type of water submersion characteristics, if you will. There was water inside where the battery meets the casing, but never actually went to the prongs that the battery connects to the internal board. Welcome back to post-editing. Hey, real quick, I just wanted to jump on here and update the results of... You could hear what just happened there. I want to update the results of my underwater test to give some update on this. It's been about 4 days since this radio was underwater, and in the 4 days this radio has dramatically decreased in its capability to operate. What I mean by that is, well, first of all, I started to notice that there was moisture getting inside of the flashlight here, and I noticed there was a little bit on the LCD as well. So I thought, that's kind of weird. Saturday morning, I went ahead and I keyed up and I started talking on it. The radio shut down on me, but then it started back up. I thought, boy, that's weird. Maybe it's a battery issue. I replaced the battery and it was still doing the same thing. Seemed to get better throughout the day. This morning when I turned on the radio to do a little bit more on this video, I noticed that I can no longer transmit. Whether I'm on VHF or UHF, it will no longer transmit. So this radio has no functionality at all anymore. Therefore, I would say it actually didn't survive the 30-minute IP67 water test that I typically do. And I still don't think that there's any reason that this one should have failed over the UV-9R Plus. I think it was just bad luck. However, it was a fail. Additionally, this radio will have a mind of its own now, and it'll start operating or putting in its own frequencies. It'll start a scanning sequence and then stop a scanning sequence. So there's definitely water internally. Is this IP67 rated? Nah. And I know I said I only had 2 tests, and this is another one, and what am I doing? And I just don't understand everything that's going on here. Why did I even choose this topic? What is the purpose of all this stuff? Anyway, I did notice that there was another couple of tests that I could probably do, and one of them happened to be because we're having a heat wave outside. Today's -3, and so I threw these radios in the snow for 15 minutes. Now, the manual does state that they should operate at about -4 degrees, and I assume that that's -4 degrees as the radio sits, not -4 outside. However, we had the cold weather, so I figured why not use it. After 15 minutes, I took these out, I turned them both on, and they were both functional. Let's talk about the receive sensitivity of both of these radios next. I briefly wanted to show you the 2 radios and the receive capabilities of each radios. Now, I'm not going to include the radio that was underwater, the UV-9R, that doesn't work anymore, but I will include the UV-9R that I've taken apart, as well as the UV-9R Plus that has been through quite a bit of torture tests. The first thing I'm going to mention and I notice is if I turn on this radio to local NOAA weather radio, about 7 miles away, with no antenna on.
Team Ignat. Slight chance of snow showers today. Waves to 4.
And now if I do the same thing with the UV-9R, and it is on right now. Here, I'll just turn it off and turn it back on for you. Nothing. No luck. So far, all of a sudden, you get this UV-9R Plus that's showing a pretty crazy receive capability. Let's go ahead and plug in the antennas and try for a further away NOAA weather radio. Starting off with the UV-9R Plus and pointing to 162.550 on NOAA weather radio frequency that is in DeKalb, Illinois, pretty far away from me. I turn on the radio.
Walworth and Kenosha counties.
No problem.
This broadcast originates from the National Weather.
And this radio actually sounds really good too, speaking of that speaker. But now if I turn on 162.550 on this radio, I got nothing. It's deaf. In fact, if I were to go to the local radio station, 105.5, I can't even barely hear that. It constantly cuts in and out. So the receive sensitivity on this functional one that didn't go underwater, by the way, is pretty poor, whereas this one is picking up things a little bit better.
Some backups as well at Roberts Road and Tower Lakes. And then heading into Chicago, it's going to take you just about 50 minutes.
I can't play long clips of these audios, but what I did notice is the first radio, which was the UV-9R, definitely sounded more muffled even at the same volume levels. And then when I switched over to the Baofeng UV-9R Plus, it sounded like it was a better sounding quality. And I'm not saying it's a great sounding quality, but I'm saying that it sounded better than the UV-9R. Even though both internally showed 16 ohms, 1 watt. Is the UV-9R Plus worth an extra $30? First, I want to say neither of these radios are Part 97 certified, so if that's something you're looking for, you might avoid both of these radios. Again, if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments below. There's a lot of objective evidence to this, and there's some subjective evidence, and so I don't know how to answer this question, except you could make your own judgment in your own mind. What I did see was there was a lot of good in the UV-9R, such as a very clean emission standard, which a lot of people unfortunately don't care about. There was a lot of good in the UV-9R Plus. It did survive underwater for 30 minutes, for example. Both radios were able to survive outside in the weather. The UV-9R Plus seemed to have better audio receive capabilities than the UV-9R, and the list just goes on and on. You've seen the video, you know. This is your decision to make. I will say for $30 you could pay for a UV-9R, but if you're going to pay the extra money to upgrade to a UV-9R Plus at $70, you might keep your eye on the Yolinko DJVX50, which is an IP67 dual band radio that has many features and sounds a lot better than either of these radios. That's just my opinion. I had a lot of fun doing this episode, and, you know, I guess I learned a lot too, which is cool. I learned be careful when taking radios apart. Not everything is what it seems, but also I learned the difference between the UV-9R and the UV-9R Plus. Yes, there are different boards internally, and I bet you if I was to buy another UV-9R from some other location, I would probably get even another different board internally. But I do hope you enjoyed all these tests, and if there's any questions I might be able to answer, please let me know in the comments below. Again, I had a fun time doing this episode. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, my sponsors today. And until next time, I'm Ham Radio Dude 73.